Moving from apology to action. From the outset, this commission has emphasized that reconciliation is not a one-time event. It is a multi-generational journey that involves all Canadians. The public apologies and compensation to residential school survivors, their families, and communities by Canada and the churches that ran the residential schools mark the beginning, not the end, of this journey. Survivors needed to hear government and church officials admit that the cultural, spiritual, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse that they suffered in the schools was wrong and should never have happened, but they needed more. The children and grandchildren of survivors needed to hear the truth about what happened to their parents and grandparents in the residential schools. At the Commission's public events, many survivors spoke in the presence of their children and grandchildren for the first time about the abuses they had suffered as children and about the destructive ways of behaving they had learned at residential schools. Many offered their own heartfelt apologies to their families for having been abusive or unable to parent or simply say, "I love you." Apologies are important to victims of violence and abuse. Apologies have the potential to restore human dignity and empower victims to decide whether they accept an apology or forgive a perpetrator. Where there has been no apology, or one that victims believe tries to justify the behavior of perpetrators and evade responsibility, reconciliation is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. The official apologies from Canada and the churches sent an important message to all Canadians that Aboriginal peoples had suffered grievous harms at the hands of the state and church institutions in the schools, and that, as the parties responsible for those harms, the state and the churches accepted their measure of responsibility. The apologies were a necessary first step in the process of reconciliation. The history and destructive legacy of residential schools is a sober reminder that taking action does not necessarily lead to positive results. Attempts to assimilate First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people into mainstream Canadian society were a dismal failure. Despite the devastating impacts of colonization, Indigenous peoples have always resisted, although in some places not successfully, attacks on their cultures, languages, and ways of life. If Canadians are to keep the promise of the apologies made on their behalf, the promise of never again, then we must guard against simply replicating the assimilation policies of the past in new forms today. As TRC honorary witness Wabkanu said, quote, "The truth about reconciliation is this: it is not a second chance at assimilation. It should not be a kinder, gentler evangelism, free from the horrors of the residential school era. Rather, true reconciliation is a second chance at building a mutually respectful relationship." End quote. The words of the apologies will ring hollow if Canada's actions fail to produce the necessary social, cultural, political, and economic change that benefits Aboriginal peoples and all Canadians. A just reconciliation requires more than simply talking about the need to heal the deep wounds of history. Words of apology alone are insufficient. Concrete actions on both symbolic and material fronts are required. Reparations for historical injustice must include not only apology, financial redress, legal reform, and policy change, but also the rewriting of national history and public commemoration. In every region of the country, survivors and others have sent a strong message, as received by this commission. For reconciliation to thrive in the coming years, Canada must move from apology to action.